This is a great day for ASRC and indeed for the entire ASRC family. It's a great day for staff, both full-time and the more than 1,000 volunteers that make up the work of ASRC. It's a great day for the more than 10,000 people ASRC has helped over 13 years, who are often desperate and given much-needed support, help and advice, especially by volunteers. I'd like to thank you all for what you've done to make this possible, to make today possible. This new facility is much larger, much more spacious than the old one. It has and will make the work of ASRC easier to fulfil than in the older, cramped establishment. All that's an advance, as so often happens in Australia. When there's a real need, people come forth to help with generosity, with their time, with compassion. Even with good government, there'd still be important areas which ARC would fill, but it would be a lesser role than that which ARC is now forced to play as a result of the present government's policies. Australia's name has been damaged around the world. We are known as the most inhumane, the most uncaring, the most selfish of all the wealthy countries. It used not to be that way. That is the journey we've travelled since Tampa. I'd like to thank the crossbench senators who understood, Senator Lambie and Senator Madigan, who despite great pressure from a number of different sources would not vote for a bill giving far too much power to the minister, to the government. I'd also like to thank Sarah Hanson-Young and the Greens for standing firm in a refugee policy based on values and humanity. The powers enshrined in the bill are appropriate to a country living beyond the reach of the rule of law. The powers enshrined in this bill are appropriate for a tyranny and not for a democracy. How did the other senators give in? How is it they came to support this most wretched government bill? We know of the inducements that the minister offered. 106 children will be allowed out of detention from Christmas Island, but can we believe him? He's made such a commitment before and not yet kept those commitments. There are hundreds of children in mainland detention in Australia. A handful have indeed been released, but the minister made the commitment to release those on mainland detention on the 19th of August. He's had August, September, October, November, and a major part of December, and they're still in detention. Is he going to release them before Christmas? Not very likely. Is he going to release them next year? Maybe he'll change his mind. The crossbench senators did not get a renewed commitment from the minister that they would be released. If he has not met this commitment made months ago, why should he meet the commitments given to the crossbench senators who supported the legislation? Why are these children more important than the 167 children on Nauru who remain in detention, whose only future is to be released into Nauru, a country and a people who do not want them? The independent senators did nothing at all to help those 167 children. Did they forget them? Did they not count them? Did they not matter? 24 babies born in Australia are being sent to Nauru with their parents. They've been classified unauthorised maritime arrivals, a novel name for a baby born in an Australian hospital. And as such, they're not eligible for resettlement in the country of their birth. They're going to Nauru, and if classified as refugees at some point in the future, will presumably be released into Nauru. The children being released from Christmas Island won't necessarily have a great future. Perhaps the independent senators forgot this. They may be back in detention or sent home due to the new fast-track process, or they may get temporary protection visas which will be reviewed at the end of every 3 years. Every 3 years they'll be in limbo. Every 3 years they'll wonder if they're going to be sent back to where they came from. We've been told that they'll never settle in Australia. There are 30 unaccompanied minors with them. They'll never see their families again because family reunion is forbidden under this government's temporary protection visas. The Minister has so often said that all boat people, including children, will not be resettled in Australia. Australia is not on the table as a possibility. So how were the independent senators persuaded that the legislation is worth supporting? Do they believe the Minister will let a few through a breach in his much repeated commitment that boat people will never be allowed to settle in Australia? It's just not realistic. He's not going to do it. Senator Xenophon, in his speech in the Parliament, said that his support is conditional on the changes taking place, which presumably include the promises made by the Minister. Unfortunately for Senator Xenophon, the legislation has passed. He kept his part of the bargain. He voted for the wretched measure. But on all the records, the government is poor at meeting commitments or keeping its word or keeping its promises. It's very good at breaking promises. I want to be very clear on one point. The crossbench senators supported this legislation, believing they had considerable concessions, have committed a political error of fundamental proportions. Whatever one thinks of the concessions, the error they have committed has done infinitely greater harm to our democratic structures. The democratic system depends on the rule of law. It depends on due process, on properly produced evidence, on precedents, and on a process that's open to appeal to a higher authority. This legislation gives the Minister, Scott Morrison, now whoever may be there in the future, total, arbitrary, dictatorial, tyrannical powers over the lives and futures of asylum seekers. It destroys the rule of law as we've come to know it and accepted through the centuries. Under the United Nations Convention, which Menzies signed on to as long ago as 1954, boat people were not illegal. The treaty makes it quite plain that those fleeing terror often travel by unorthodox means, and often without papers. You could not go to a tyrant in some country and say, "You've killed half my family. I want to get a passport and a visa, please, before you kill the other half of my family." It tears up international law concerning what is called non-refoulement. We must not send people back to countries where they might be subject to torture. This government now says people can change their behaviour. They can modify their behaviour. And if they do that, they won't be subject to torture. Or if they go back, they could go and live in another part of the country where perhaps they're not going to be known and authorities will leave them in peace. How naive, how ignorant can this government possibly be? The Minister's decisions are absolute. They are not subject to review. The determination procedures have been short-circuited to such an extent that any legitimate examination of a boat person's case would be almost impossible. This is a far cry from the Australia we used to know, but it is today's Australia as a gift from the Abbott government. In short, then, the government is no longer committed to the United Nations Refugee Convention. The new law strips out references to the convention. They are replaced by a new definition of refugee that drops the long-standing commitment to non-refoulement. The law states that it is irrelevant whether Australia has non-refoulement obligations in respect to an unlawful non-citizen. This means that Australia can now return an asylum seeker to a country where they have been known or where it is known they may be tortured again. The new law removes any existing checks and balances that provides protections for those seeking asylum. Secondly, the new law gives totally unreasonable power to the Minister, especially to the Minister for Immigration. He has more power over the fate of individuals than does the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Attorney General, or the whole of government combined. The Minister will now decide the fate of asylum seekers, whether they're eligible for a visa, whether they're sent back to where they came from, even though torture may be a possibility. There is no review from the Minister's decision, no review at all. Previous ministers for immigration have wanted to shed the responsibility that ultimately, in the last resort, sometimes lay with them. And so to put that as responsibility into a proper process, but not this minister. No, he wants the power for himself, and a power without review. The minister can push an asylum seeker boat back to sea and leave it there. He can block an asylum seeker from making a protection claim on the vaguely defined grounds of character or national interest. His reasons can be kept secret. He will not make them public. He can detain people without charge, deport them to any country he chooses, even if it's from a place where they will be tortured. The minister's powers are outside the rule of law, and this is what we clearly need to understand. They are beyond appeal. It is the power of a tyrant, and we need to recognize it. We cannot pretend that this is just a minor change. It represents a destruction of the democratic process. Thus, the crossbench senators, Xenophon, Wang, Lazarus, Day, Lernholm and Muir, are wrong because their grievous political error has betrayed Australian democracy, and they should not be allowed to get away with it. That doesn't mean to say that the government is not responsible. Of course the government is. It's promoted these particular matters. But the crossbench senators pretend to stand for something better. But they've not. They've supported something worse. They've cooperated by tearing up international conventions, practices of international law, all necessary if we're ever to establish a better and a safer world. The legislation reinterprets our own law, and whatever safeguards there may have been in it are destroyed. The concessions the crossbench senators exacted from the government, important as they may be to some individuals, are minuscule compared to the damage that those crossbench senators have accomplished for Australian democracy and for Australian decency. We might spare a moment for the future, because it's going to be much better than the present or the past. Today the bill applies to all asylum seekers, but it establishes a new practice beyond the rule of law. If there is another group the government does not like, will it extend a similar practice to that group? Because once a government embraces such policies, the policies tend to spread, the practices tend to be used again and again, and we can all point to countries where that has happened. Let me end on a much happier note. I again congratulate ASRC for what has been achieved, for the work that you've collectively done in assisting over time thousands of individuals for their advocacy for values and principles which are important to all of us. And it has never in Australia's time never been more seriously needed than it is right at this particular time. Because opposition to the measures the government has introduced, opposition to this government, needs to be reinforced and strengthened, and make sure that more and more people know exactly what the government has done.